The rain hit the city like it had a grudge. It wasn't polite about it. No drizzle, no romantic mist, just hard, relentless sheets that made the streetlights smear and the gutters moan. My coat was thin, my shoes had that wet sponge sound, and my hair looked like I'd lost a fight with a mop. I was late for a double shift at Picati, $2 short on rent, and already rehearsing the kinds of apologies that don't get you extra tips. If you've ever worked a night job that survives on no-shows and late-night regulars, you learn to move with a particular economy of disappointment. You stack plates with the same steady hands you use to stack excuses. You measure your day by tips and transit schedules, by whether the fryers are merciful that night, by how many drunks you can shepherd out without taking their mood home in your skin. I had learned those measures the hard way because living on them teaches you humility fast. The bus that should have been there wasn't. It came a half-hour late and was full of people who smelled of damp wool and regrets. I stood on the curb, clutching my umbrella that had, at some point, split its allegiance and protected nothing. A Mercedes pulled up beside me like it belonged there by virtue of its coloring alone, black, low, and smirking. The back window rolled down, and for a second I thought the man inside was an advertisement for a haircut magazine. Hair neat enough to hurt, a suit that didn't need to try, and eyes the precise shade of someone who'd learned how to read rooms for a living. "Need a lift?" he asked, as if the rain and the collapse of public transportation were a private joke we could both share. I should have said no. I should have tightened my grip on the umbrella and turned away, because the city has taught me to count the risks of kindness in cash and the price of a ride after midnight. But there was a rational, human part of me that weighed the situation. Broken bus, drenching rain, my shoes squelching like they were pleading. So I tucked my chin, slid into the back seat, and let the smell of cologne and expensive leather wash over me. His name tag, when he gave it, felt absurdly aristocratic, Cassian. He said it like a secret you'd been privileged to learn. With a smile that looked practiced but not false, he handed me an umbrella. It had a wooden handle and a seam of gold thread in the fabric. It smelled faintly of citrus and long hotel stays. "You should get a dry one," he said. There was nothing prayful or high-minded about it. It was simpler. A man offering shelter from the weather. Kindness in such small denominations has a reputation. It's the sort you don't always cash in. "Thanks," I said. "My name's Marlowe." I had 3 jobs then, and this was just one of them. I said my name like it was an order on a chit, because names in my line of work had to be said quickly and returned. He asked where Picati was, and I told him, like anyone would, like it was the center of the neighborhood. He listened in a way that made me think he'd read about places like ours in books where people are brave. When he parked and the rain spat at the windows, he frowned briefly at the way the city looked when it was wet and made another offer to walk me under the umbrella. We got inside the restaurant and he melted into the dark like he knew the world had ways of being mean to small people. He sat at the counter like he had been there 1,000 times and fit. He ordered espresso, no sugar, and watched me while the machine hissed. There was nothing theatrical in that watching. It was just attention, the kind you notice when you spend your life being overlooked. The next day, he walked into my life again. I remember it like a rubber band snap, sudden, unexpected, and loud enough to sting. It was a little after midnight, the kitchen smelled like garlic and burnt sugar, and I had my hair up in a band because hair down meant customers thought you tried. The bell above the door threw drama like a prop, and the man who came in wasn't the same polished stranger from the Mercedes. He hardly looked like he had enough energy left to sit up. One minute I was thinking about restocking napkins, the next minute I was looking at a man who could have been on a magazine, if magazines printed pictures of men who bled. He stumbled in like a punch had been taken out of him, blood dark against the collar of his shirt. He didn't collapse in the middle of the dining room. He swung, somehow, and landed against the service door like a thing that had been measured to a point of breaking. People in Picati are usually polite to drifters. It's part of the job.
We serve people who act like their hunger is a moral failing. This man didn't ask for anything. He just looked at me with eyes that said, "Help." Then he swayed and the back door banged and the night shrank to the sound of a knife hitting tile. "Back," I said, because it was reflex. Nights teach you verbs, back, now, help, and you use them like keys. I shoved a chef's coat over his shoulders because that's the kind of thing you do when someone is bleeding through a shirt. You cover them with what you have. Jenna took one look and made a face like she'd swallowed something bitter. "Marlo, Jenna started. "He's hurt," I snapped. There was a cadence to emergencies that made the kitchen move like a living thing. Tony dropped a pot lid, Maria grabbed towels, and the city outside kept raining and not caring at all. The first shot of panic is always absurdly practical. Get him away from the door, clear the dining room, call no one in particular. The second thought, adrenaline time, was where the hell do I hide a man who has people who want him dead? The answer for me was the supply closet. It was small and full of paper towels and that brisk disinfectant smell that makes everything feel a little more managed than it actually is. I'd hidden drunk teenagers there, kids trying to make out in greasy corner booths. Once, even a raccoon that had decided Picati's back window was its destiny. A man with gunshot wounds was new, but desperate times find desperate crates. I didn't know his name in that moment. I only knew the shape of violence and how it sketched at the edges of people's faces. There was a small black thing in his hand, a shard of plastic or metal. He bit down on it as if it could be a talisman. He spoke, but it came out small and gurgled. He kept saying, "Not here, not..." The closet was tight. I shut the door and dragged him inside like he was someone I owed. His shirt was wet with blood, and the stain smelled metallic and spring raw. I jammed towels against the wound and pressed. He flinched but didn't scream. He just looked at me as if he'd found a lighthouse or a promise. "What's your name?" I asked. It was a stupid question. Names don't fix wounds. They matter later, when you need to tell a story about saving a life. "Cassian," he said, and the way he said it made it sound like he'd been practicing to say it when the world asked. I folded towels until my arms shook. The thing between his teeth, he'd crushed it as if it were a cigarette, was a tiny, jagged cylinder. He spat it out, and I looked at it the way you look at something that doesn't belong in a kitchen supply closet. Jenna poked her head in and whispered, "Mar, we can't keep him here." "Then let's not keep him here long," I said. I always respond to fear with plans. It's how I manage being scared. Plans are rational, enforceable, physical things that I can put my hands on. "He has people," she said. "You know that, right? They shot up the alley. There were 2 cars idling." "He walked in," I said. "He came through our door. We didn't invite the bullets." Saying it loud made it almost true. He coughed. A little more blood, and he went quiet like someone who would run out of words. When you're up to your elbows in towels, there's an odd intimacy in this kind of care. You memorize the rhythm of breath. You can read a person by how their fingers twitch. He kept his jaw clenched, like whatever he'd swallowed was still trying to bite its way free. It was then that I saw the other thing, a small bruise along his temple, a stub of gunpowder near the collar. He smelled like leather and something antiseptic, like a hospital hallway I once ran down, hoping somebody would tell me the man I loved wouldn't die. It was a smell that made me breathe wrong. "Why'd you come in?" I asked, not because I expected the truth, but because sometimes asking is how you keep yourself sane. He swallowed, and his hand, wet and shaky, found mine. It was colder than the rest of him. "You helped me," Cassian said. There was a moment, a full, slow one, when the rain and the thought of that Mercedes clicked into place. A ride, an umbrella. A man who'd given me shelter when my own life felt like an inventory of small losses. I remember my chest folding like a tired chair. "You're the Mercedes guy," I said. It wasn't a question anymore. He nodded. I remembered the way you didn't make me feel like I had to explain being soaked. I wanted to laugh, but the sound was a croak. I'm a waitress, I said. I hand people cups and they give me quarters. You don't get to be poetic about it. He smiled, and in that smile, the world reassembled itself with a little more leverage. I have debts, he said. Not the kind you leave with a receipt, the dangerous kind. You helped me because you were kind. If kindness is the currency you keep in your pockets, you're richer than you look, I said. It was a joke, expected and cheap, but it landed somewhere warm between us. He reached out and touched my hand, like someone trying to verify that things were real. Why did you help me? He asked, genuinely curious. There's always a reason when you help someone. You're bored, you're human, you believe in the world being less terrible than it actually is. For me, the answer was more personal. I had been raised by a mother who taught me the art of small mercies. She'd insisted that every plate we put in front of someone should be an act of dignity. So when a man staggers into your restaurant with blood on his shirt and a fear in his eyes, you don't catalog the danger. You reach for a towel. I didn't like the look of you, I said. You looked scared. He nodded slowly. Behind his pain, there was a pocket of something civilized. He kept his fingers laced together, like a man trying not to show weakness. They call me Cassian Castellano, he said finally. The name had a weight to it, one that didn't need to be explained to carry danger. That night, Jenna sent Maria to call Jenna's cousin who lived a few blocks over. Jenna's cousin, Jenna said, had a couch, lived alone, and didn't ask a lot of questions. When you need temporary harbor, you take the kind of help that's as anonymous as a couch and as blunt as a door. We wrapped Cassian in layers of coats, tucked towels into the collar, and walked him out through the back alley like it was something our city had always contained, miracles disguised as furtive movements. Cars idled at the curb, 2 of them. We moved like we had to be parts of an agreement neither side had read. No one shouted, but there was a rhythm, doors opening and closing, tires sucking precipitation, the city making a sound like someone turning a page. We moved, breath shallow, and I had the ridiculous thought that whatever had happened to this man would now be my story to carry. People who work in restaurants collect stories like saucepans. They hang them up behind a counter to remember what the night cooked up. Jenna's cousin lived in a place that smelled like lemon oil and old vinyl. He had taxidermy birds on his wall and a habit of falling asleep on the sofa with the TV blaring. When you need temporary harbor, you take the kind of help that's as anonymous as a couch and as blunt as a door. We wrapped Cassian in layers of coats, tucked towels into the collar, and walked him out through the back alley like it was something our city had always contained. Miracles disguised as furtive movements. Cars idled at the curb, 2 of them. We moved like we had to be parts of an agreement neither side had read. No one shouted, but there was a rhythm. Doors opening and closing, tires sucking precipitation, the city making a sound like someone turning a page. We moved, breath shallow, and I had the ridiculous thought that whatever had happened to this man would now be my story to carry. People who work in restaurants collect stories like saucepans. They hang them up behind the counter to remember what the night cooked up. Jenna's cousin lived in a place that smelled like lemon oil and old vinyl. He had taxidermy birds on his wall and a habit of falling asleep on the sofa with the TV blaring. We eased Cassian onto the couch like we were tucking in a child who had been up past his bedtime. Jenna's cousin, a simple man named Al, put blankets over him and said, "Don't worry, I'll call no one." Jenna left me alone with him for a minute, a small window of privacy that felt invasive and necessary. He blinked at the ceiling like he'd been somewhere and had only just found his way back. "You're shaking," I said. He laughed once, a ragged little sound. "Yes," he said, "I am." We talked in fragments, half-formed sentences stitched together by urgency. He told me he wasn't safe. He told me he'd made mistakes and that people thought mistakes were currencies to be spent. He told me that certain men from the East had decided to take a toll on him and his family. He said names softly as if each one had teeth. "Why tell me?" I asked. "Because you gave me a ride," he said simply. "Because you gave me shelter when the city forgot how." I wanted to tell him all the things he couldn't buy, that the apartments above the laundromat had tenants who paid their electric bills regularly, that Picati's tips didn't stretch to the end of the week, that my hands were calloused from pushing plates and not from polishing metals. Instead, I boiled water and made him some of the cheap black tea I drank when I worked nights. Tea is an honest thing. It creates a pause where the world can settle and some words can be said. After an hour, he slept like someone who had banked an entire day's worth of exhaustion. He looked oddly small and human on the couch, under a blanket that smelt of lemon and old furniture polish. I didn't think of the man he might be, an heir, a boss, a danger. I thought only of silhouettes and how the city had been generous to me in the smallest possible manner. "Don't take my money," he murmured when he half woke. "I can compensate, give—" "No," I said. "You can leave a thank you, a story. Maybe someday you'll owe someone else and remember the way it felt to be refused the easy route." He nodded, sleep thick, and I realized then that his life wasn't just about envelopes passed in back rooms. There was a soul tucked under that suit, a knot of human fear and stubborn hope. When I left Jenna's apartment to walk home, Dawn was thinning the rain into a polite suggestion. I thought the matter was closed, that I'd given someone a towel and a couch and nothing more. My hands still smelt faintly of bleach and tea. I told myself I did not do miracles. I did not sign up for narratives where my name would be embroidered onto someone else's destiny. I had a rent due and a shift opening in 6 hours. Real life settles you back like a chair. And that's where it would have stopped. Except the world doesn't honor the neat lines we draw. People cross into your life like fissures in pavement, and kindness acts like a seed. The first time I saw Cassian after that night wasn't in a picture booked in my memory as something cinematic. It was 20 minutes from closing, when the friars were starting to sigh and the last of the regulars had left, and the bell over the door decided it was going to make an entrance. He came in like something broken but determined. He didn't walk so much as he was carried by intent. My hands stalled mid-wipe. Before I could call someone over, a figure stepped into the doorway, a man with the face the city keeps for when it wants you afraid. He had a voice like a low wind and eyes that didn't blink at easy comforts. He was not a customer. His gait had calculation. "Evening," he said, but the word felt like taper slapped across a window. He didn't look at the dining room. He looked only at the back where a man leaned against the service door, then fell. Shots fired like a punctuation mark, the whole place folded into it, the sizzle of oil, the light above the counter, the hush like the world inhaling. People dropped to knees, glass tinked, and the back room became an altered planet. I can still hear, in my head, the precise metallic sound of a bottle falling and rolling slow across tile. I saw Cassian, blood painting the edge of his shirt, and whatever reflex lives inside people who have spent their lives navigating small crises kicked in. I hurled myself through the kitchen like a battering ram of practicality. Jenna mouthed, "Marlo, don't!" But there is no don't when the arc of your life reaches the point where someone needs you. I grabbed Cassian and shoved him into the supply closet like I'd done it every day of my life. The door slammed and the room shrank. His breath was ragged and shallow. He made a noise that wasn't a word and bit something between his teeth until I thought his jaw would fracture. "Don't swallow it," he said between gasps. "Don't." Then he clamped his lips shut and tried to smile through pain. I pressed towels again, more forcefully, and his eyes locked on mine. There was no theater in them, no calculation, no plan.
There was only a man very close to death making a sound like a person refusing to fold. They were after him, Jenna hissed through the door. Cars in the alley, men in the lot. We have to get him out, I whispered. My voice came out as a machine pressing down slow and decisive. We move him to Jenna's cousins and we call no one. That's not, she began, but she stopped because there were too many reasons it wasn't safe. There are times when the safest option is to break protocol. There are times when you hide people in cupboards and swear your life to the fact that mercy is not a crime. We wrapped Cassian in coats again, but this time someone had followed. The alley outside had the sour tang of an engine idling, and the streetlights made wet pavement look like polished coin. I felt the city press at the bore like it wanted back in. "Why did you come back?" I asked him later, when we were halfway across the block and my lungs felt like they'd been wrong. "Because I thought about the way your hand didn't flinch," he said. "Because when it comes down to it, people are the only currency I can still spend. You gave me that." He winced. "You didn't seem like someone who sold kindness cheap." "You don't know much about me," I said. We were under the umbrella again, him hunched under the weight of coats, me holding the wood like an oar. "You don't know about my shirts or my rent, or that I love the idea of opening a restaurant that tastes like home to everyone." He laughed once quite softly. "That sounds dangerous in a good way." Dangerous in a good way. I had to admit that the phrasing made me look at him differently. It made the world look writable. Maybe that's what he wanted. Someone who could imagine a world where his name didn't come wrapped in threats. That night, as I tucked him into Jenna's cousin's couch, he touched my arm lightly and said, "You didn't have to do that." "You came into my restaurant bleeding," I said. "I didn't have an option. I had a job." Later, when the adrenaline numbed and the city became a distant machine humming, I sat on the stoop and realized that a single act of sheltering had changed the shape of my week. A ride in the rain had been a hinge in a story that had teeth. It had been small and human, and now it had teeth. At 2 in the morning, I walked home, and the city smelled like cold concrete and fried onions. I kept thinking about the way his hand had closed around mine for a second, how his breath had once steadied when I held a towel the right way. The thing about moments is that they erect themselves into claims. You may think you're the one doing the giving, but sometimes the person who receives a kindness changes the giver in ways small and seismic. I told myself to forget it. I had rent, 3 upcoming shifts, and a bed that squeaked in agreement. There is a practical poetry to survival. I knew it well. But the next morning, I found myself looking for the black Mercedes out my window, and my hands felt like they were expecting something to slide into them. A secret envelope or a receipt that said my life had been altered on account of being human. If you're still with me, if a rainy night meeting with strangers who keep secrets and carry bullets sounds like your kind of story, stick around. This one's messy, and not all kindness ends pretty. It gets dirty. It asks for your hands. The day after, I was at the counter, taking orders and balancing a tray like a benediction, when the bell over the door made that sound that meant people were stepping into a story. Cassian came back in, looking less like a man and more like a man who'd been put through a blender. His shirt gapped, and his eyes held a heat I recognized. Fear, but edged with something like resolve. He moved with a strange economy, all purpose and no pride. "You're trouble," I said when I came up to take his order. I kept my voice light because that's the job, to act like nothing in the universe is about to combust. "You started it," he answered. "You gave me a towel." Tony hovered with a coffee pot like an oversized sentinel. Maria policed the floor with a practiced smile. And for a beat, the restaurant was those things we are: snotty, beautiful, ordinary. Then a shadow stepped across the threshold like bad weather arriving early. A man I hadn't seen before scanned the room.
And even though he was in a suit, his accessory was menace. It happened fast afterwards. A car backfired, the kitchen light shimmered like it had an intolerance for interruption, and then, like a bad dream getting its timing right, someone threw something that sounded too much like a gunshot. Panic is a thing that rearranges people's bones. Conversations stop mid-chew. Coffee cups tremble. The nearest thing to us is suddenly all that matters. I did the only thing I knew how to do. I moved. I moved like a person who'd practiced in the kitchen that life requires your hands to be decisive. I grabbed Cassian, shoved him into the supply closet, and we lived inside the breath of towels and the smell of bleach and fear. He bit a small thing between his teeth, the same jagged cylinder he'd carried before, and I could see the pain ripple across his face in quick little waves. His breathing was shallow. He didn't speak. He simply looked at me like someone who'd been given a spare moment in a life that didn't afford them. There are moments in life when everything contractually sensible runs out, and you must do dumb human things. You lift someone who shouldn't be lifted. You lie to people who have power over you. You keep your mouth shut when you want to shout into tiled rooms. I felt like that then, like the world had given me the book and I only knew half the words. We made it to Jenna's cousins again. He put his blanket over Cassian and refused to let anyone in. Al liked a simple life, and the idea of being involved in somebody else's bleeding made him miserable. I didn't blame him. I slept in a chair, half vertical, with my hands curled like a person holding on to a small miracle. When dawn pried the night from our teeth, I left. I told myself it was to get groceries, to check my messages, to arrange the kind of life that keeps a person unremarkable. But I also wanted to see if the man I had helped was still breathing. There is a selfishness to kindness. It makes you curious. He slept when I returned, and in sleep, his face wasn't a ledger, but an ordinary map. His hand, when he moved in the half-sleep, knocked a corner of the blanket, and he muttered something in Italian that I didn't understand. He was a puzzle and a person. "You're a stubborn sort," he said when he woke up and saw me. "I don't do patient bleeding," I teased. It was a line, and he took it like a gift. He tried to offer me money then, and I refused. Money is an uncomplicated solution to complicated problems.
If I took it, the story would be mercenary. I didn't want his gratitude to be measurable by bills. He reached into a jacket and brought out a small card, the kind of card that smells faintly of old leather and money. "For after," he said, "if you ever need a hand." I laughed and shoved the card back toward him. "You got shot in my restaurant," I said. "I don't accept bribes. I accept apologies in the form of decent coffee and a night off." He laughed too, a sound that broke the tension for a thin moment. It was the kind of sound that implies there are better jokes waiting in the wings. I found myself watching his mouth and thinking about how the city changes people, bends them or breaks them, and how a small kindness can be a wedge in a life that otherwise looks inevitable. When I left that day, it felt like a beginning and a wound at the same time. I had no idea that a man in a black Mercedes and a suit that hugged him like a uniform would become the axis of a story that would tilt everything I believed about safety, love, and choice. But the rain had already written its line across my life, and I had accepted the umbrella. The city kept spinning, the fryer kept spitting, and in the back of my head, a small, insistent voice began to ask what happens next when you save someone from the rain and they return with blood on their cuff. After that night, the rain didn't stop feeling like a line drawn through my life. It kept showing up in the small places, an umbrella forgotten on a chair, a puddle puddling toward the door, and in the large ones, like men you didn't know showing up on corners. Cassian tried to disappear after Jenna's cousin tucked him into the couch, but he didn't vanish the way men in suits sometimes do. He reappeared with a sort of apology and a firmness that didn't ask permission. "You shouldn't be around this," he said the morning he found me at the counter. He had been patched up, enough to look presentable, and he'd brought a man with him who smelled like antiseptic and winter spice. The man introduced himself as Val, and he had the shoulders of someone who could make a room shut its mouth.
Val's eyes slid over me like inventory, and he didn't smile. "Thanks for last night," Cassian said, "but this can't continue. You're exposed." "To what? Being kind?" I said. It sounded foolish and like a dare. Val didn't laugh. "Cassian's enemies will look for places he's known to go. Restaurants, bars, friends. You work at Picati." "I work at Picati every night for tips and the occasional free slices of misery," I said. "That doesn't mean your enemies get a map to my life." Cassian looked at me then like he could see all my frayed edges. "Because of what you did, I asked my family to help," he said carefully. "They want to make sure you are safe." Family. The word landed in my mouth like cold silver. There is a way certain people attach ceremony to their pain. Salvatore, I would later learn, did that, like it deserved a ledger. Cassian's restraint pulled at something private inside me. Either he wanted me safe, or he wanted me out of danger. Maybe he wanted both. "You don't have to," I told him. It was honest and small. Protection wasn't free. It sometimes cost the thing you were trying to protect most. Val cut a half smile. "She can come to the compound for a few days. No cameras, no paper trail. It's temporary." I pictured a compound, and the world slapped me with images from 1,000 movies. Gates, guards, manicured lawns. I pictured none of those with the reality I knew. Squeaky beds, laundromat dryers, the smell of grease in the night. "I'm not leaving Picati," I said, because I wasn't going to be the kind of person who ran every time a shadow decided to take an interest. Cassian's jaw worked. "You saved me, Marlowe. Let us repay that." There is a difference between being rescued and being bought. I refused money. I'd learned enough about the way gratitude can become transaction. But safety was different. Safety had a shape you could put your hands on, a locked door, a mattress you didn't have to fight with, a night where you could breathe without thinking about whether someone would shoot through the glass. 3 nights, I said finally. "I'll come for 3 nights. After that, I find my own way." Val nodded, like he'd expected me to bargain. 3 nights, then we'll reassess. No more. That was how I found myself in a car that smelled faintly of leather and coffee, the kind of car that moves like it has a purpose. We drove out of the city and into a quieter geography where houses had distance between them and security cameras were replaced by hedges. The compound was less ostentatious than I expected. Lots of beige, efficient landscaping, a garage that smelled like oil disguised as something sensible. It wasn't scary, it was practical, like a woman who fixed things rather than a man who broke them. I met Salvatore the first night in a room that had the soft sternness of men who've been given too many negotiations. He was older than Cassian, lean and composed, with a face that didn't make a habit of smiling. He didn't gush, he observed. He didn't need to be loud because he was a man who had taught others the value of silence. "You put her at risk," he said, when Cassian offered excuses. There was no malice in the observation, only the bluntness of someone assessing ledger entries. "But she helped my nephew." "I didn't invite that trouble," I said, "because truth is a way to stake ground. He came into my restaurant bleeding." Salvatore's eyes flicked to mine like he'd been watching for that sentence. "And now you find yourself in the ledger," he said softly. "We will make her ledger different." They didn't offer me jewelry. They didn't offer me a new life on a silver platter. They offered me training, a few rules, in a room with decent curtains. They told me the truth about who Cassian was, that he had a name that carried weight and blood that answerable hands kept neat. They also told me that Cassian wanted something that made everyone uncomfortable, to move parts of the family's business away from old ways. He wanted legitimate investments, real restaurants, businesses that paid taxes and hired locals. There was a tenderness in his plan that was either madness or sincerity. I couldn't tell which, and I couldn't afford to bet my life on either. The days at the compound blurred into a different rhythm. Wake, run, repair, practice. The morning air had a different smell there, pine and machine oil and faint lemon from cleaners. Less of the city's diesel and more of something calculated. I met the other people who kept Cassian's world turning. Val, who moved like a man whose fingers knew more about fixing things than breaking them. A medic named Rosa, who could stitch like a seamstress of human flesh. And men and women whose faces had the steady patience of people who had been given hard tasks and learned to carry them without complaint. Val was rough with me at first. He'd show me how to move when danger was in the room. How to hold your phone, how to make sure doors were closed behind you, how to use your body to create space. There were no long lectures. He gave me micro lessons and repeated them until they fit in my hands. Awareness, he'd say, tapping his temple. Use it. Training is a quiet thief. It steals your excuses. It is practical and honest. I ran sprints until my lungs remembered their job. I learned how to close my hand into a fist without thinking about being ashamed of the calluses on it. Val taught me how to lock doors quietly, how to move a body across a threshold, how to keep someone from bleeding out long enough to get help. But he didn't go into the engineering of wounds. He taught me to be useful, and that usefulness was a salve. Cassian and I had time together, in small increments. He would come by the training yard, pale as a noon, like a man who had been re-provisioned, and we'd talk in the plainness of people who had learned to barter truths. He told me about his grandfather's insistence on respect, Salvatore's slow command, the ways the family's habits had calcified into nightmarish rhythms. He didn't romanticize his world. He apologized for it the way someone apologizes for the weather, matter-of-fact and small. "Why Picati?" I asked him once as we sat on the edge of a lawn that smelled like cut grass and petitions for forgiveness. "Because it was real," he said. "Not the kind of real you get in photographs. The kind where the cook stays late to clean the floor because it matters. I wanted something that couldn't be bought by fear." I laughed because it sounded like the sort of answer written by people who didn't measure their days in tips. "You think a restaurant can fix things?" "No," he said, "but it's a beginning I can be honest about." There is a difference between saying, "I want to be better," and actually changing the ledger of your life. I'll give Cassian this. He meant it enough to risk being laughed at. That didn't make it noble, it just made it earnest. The political meetings happened when they had to. The commission comprised of men who exhausted their charm and traded it for the calculus of survival. They met in rooms with heavy tables and heavy silence, where men spoke in slow measures, as if words were money. Cassian asked Marlowe to stay out of these. Salvatore wanted to keep her safe, and the commission didn't want witnesses who weren't complicit. But I was a stubborn piece of human furniture. Watching men negotiate the fate of neighborhoods wasn't glamorous. It was claustrophobic and theatrical in the way a funeral has theatricality. The Bratva were the kind of problem that didn't knock politely. Vulov's name came like a shadow, a man from the East who liked his deals loud and his reprisals loudest. He didn't want gentle negotiations. He wanted a return on something he had already invested emotion into. The idea that power remains visible and not polished. He sent messages that were not messages, and he waited for replies that were blood. The warehouse explosion was the kind of escalation that announced itself without subtlety. I was at the compound when the news arrived. Men crowded, radios whispering like it was a sermon. A warehouse on the periphery had been hit. Crates that used to hold legitimate goods found themselves suddenly in other men's ledgers. The commission met in an emergency, faces tight, hands pressed to coffee cups. Salvatore looked exhausted in a way that made his skin draw tight. "Vulov wants a war he can see," Salvatore said quietly, his voice the kind that cataloged damage. "He wants to make examples." "Then we have to make sure the examples he picks are not at random," Cassian said, already moving into counter-calculation. There was a tired air to him, the sort that happens to people who have to give orders and then live with them. Time didn't feel linear during the escalation. It felt like a coil being wound. Small actions, replies, reprisals. We began moving more, sheltering more, sanctifying things like grocery runs with the etiquette of avoidance. There was a moment, I remember it like a ticked heart, when a convoy had to move a shipment across town. The plan was sensible and dull, and it required an innocuous garage for one last stop. That was the night of the garage chase. We were on our way out, Val at the wheel, Cassian beside him, me tucked into the back with a duffel bag that smelled faintly of my shampoo and something like antiseptic. The garage door rolled up and we drove out, tires kissing wet pavement. The city held its breath with us. A block from the compound, a line of black SUVs slid into view like the horizon closing. Someone ahead flashed lights. It should have been routine. It shouldn't have been. Val moved like a man who had practiced sliding out of traps. The SUVs pressed. Someone behind us hit the gas and the world ignited into motion. Val swore, short, efficient syllables, and pushed the car through a geometry of alleys that smelt faintly of oil and fear. I wasn't a naive passenger. I had been taught how to brace, to trust someone else who knew how to steer when chaos arrived. We took a turn too sharp and tires squealed against the street, and for a terrifying second, a truck's back bumper grazed ours. Then we hit a dead end, a fence, a gate made of iron. Val slammed the brakes. Men in the SUVs stepped out, rifles slung, faces like bored judges. The air filled with the smell of gasoline and wet rubber. The chase lasted less than 5 minutes and felt as long as a lifetime of calculations. We split. Val kicked a door open, Cassian hauling a crate like it mattered. I did something that felt small and huge at once. I moved toward the back exit and kicked a rusted panel free. The world let me through, and we ran, a human parcel of desperation, through a service gate and into the teeth of a street market where people shouted about fish and onions and life. A vendor pushed a cart between us and the men in suits, and for a breath, the city was a crowd and not a map. I felt my heart beat so hard it hurt. When we were finally clear, we sat in a diner that made the city feel like something you could swallow. Val breathed like a man who had smoked for 20 years, but he was laughing in a way that was half awe and half defeat. "You did good back there," he told me, as if my leaning against him was a private victory. "You told me to run the door," I said. "I did." "Yes," he said, and the tone had approval in it, which is rarer and harder than praise. "You did right." Moments like those stitch themselves into the seams of nights. They make the abstract human and the human harder to ignore. Back at the compound after the chase, Salvatore called an urgent meeting. The commission convened and the room smelt like strong coffee and compromise. They spoke in the particular language of men who move pieces on maps. Cassian's plan was simple and audacious. Open Picati as a real restaurant under new management, keep it as a neutral hub, and funnel legitimate contracts through it to make a visible shift. If the family had cash moving through legal avenues, they could start to untie old obligations. "But will the other families, will they buy this?" one man asked, his voice like a stone thrown in a still pond. "They will if we show them we want to buy ourselves," Cassian said. "If we put good on the table, they will have to choose." It was a gamble. It was also an argument rooted in the idea that not all inheritance needed to be handed down in blood. There were men who liked violence and couldn't be persuaded otherwise. Vulov, for all his bluster, was one of those men. We prepared. Picati, under my hands and with the help of Maria and Tony, became a legitimate project. We scrubbed the menu, reorganized nets of suppliers, began to keep invoices that didn't require coded language. My days blurred into a new shape. Mornings at the compound, afternoons checking inventory, evenings at Picati balancing books and folding napkins with cleaner hands. The restaurant, which had always been a refuge for people who needed food, became something else, a front for a better ledger and a test of whether a place could change its meaning in a neighborhood.
My nights were no longer mine. People watched, cataloged my comings and goings, and Val taught me how to create illusions of privacy. I learned to move in and out of doors with the economy of someone who values a closed mouth. There were nights I slept like a locker room towel, folded and used, and nights I slept like a person who had found a corner of peace. The difference felt like the weather. The attacks escalated. Volov's people burned a storage lot that belonged to one of the families who had agreed to a neutral arrangement. Then another warehouse, an old building that had been converted, blew up in a roll of static that smelled like old paper and ruin. Nobody slept well. The commission meetings became longer, and the men who looked in charge began to seem smaller in the face of that kind of aggression. You can make plans until your page runs out of ink, but the ground won't promise not to shake. One night, when Picati was quiet and the rain made the windows weep in the way rain does when it wants to be dramatic, my apartment was hit. Someone threw a brick through the window and smeared our front lean into our living room like a message. It wasn't meant to be personal, except it was. Threats started to read like invitations. My neighbors watched me carry the shards of our life to the trash and offered me soup like an offering. I told myself it was vandalism. I told myself a million small lies to keep my courage steady. That was the last straw. Salvatore called us to action, not the kind with knives and plans, but the kind where a community had to build a firewall of normalcy. Picati would be open. Picati would be present. We would not let men with bonfires of violence decide who could breathe in the neighborhood. I took on the management of the restaurant like a person stepping into the center of a storm. I learned to manage not just food, but people, their fears, their payrolls. I balanced ledgers that read like prayers: rent paid, payroll met, insurance called. The kitchen became a theater for practical miracles, limited cost recipes that tasted like generosity. We renovated the back room to make it safer and more discreet, and we hired an extra pair of hands to watch the door. I trained the staff in non-technical ways: how to move customers when the world tilted, where to place candles to lower panic. We rehearsed in whispers. And then they came. The attack on Picati was not a subtle affair. It was a living thing that arrived in the dark like an accusation. I was in the kitchen when I heard the first crash, something thrown against glass, the low shout that has no language but intent. Smoke arrived like a rumor, thick and mean, and the light stuttered like tired lungs. The night reassembled itself around the instinct to protect. I remember how the kitchen smells at that moment: oil, garlic, and the bitter tang of fear. Pots clanged as people scattered. I felt my hands move before my brain could catch up. I slid an apron tighter around my waist and vanished into the flow of what my life had made me good at: organizing chaos into something that looked like order. Val found me near the prep station. He had a cloth wrapped around his hand and his jaw set. "Get the staff to the basement," he said. "Keep the customers back and get to the alley if you can." The door to Picati was a flap that once welcomed people and now let in men who looked for a theater of violence. Men with faces carved from purpose moved like predators. There was smoke in the air and a smell of something sharp. The attackers didn't have the courtesy to be poetic. They shouted and pushed. Volov was there, taller than I thought from the pictures, his voice like an instrument tuned to menace. Cassian moved like a man who had decided to end a calculation. He stepped from the counter and into the light with a kind of stillness I had seen when he'd been hurt and chosen not to die. He was calm in a way that made my mouth dry. My heart said, "Hide." My hands said, "Help." The two arguments did not get along. The fight was a geometry of interruption. Smoke made shapes in the room like ghosts, and chaos rearranged the furniture into obstacles. I did what I could. I barricaded a door with a table. I guided old Mrs. Klein into the kitchen and sat her on a chair, taking her hand until she stopped trembling. At one point, a man came at me. An instinct made me pull a tray from the counter and swing it like a shield. It hit him with a hollow sound that made him stumble. It wasn't heroics, it was improvisation. I moved like someone who had been taught to use whatever was on hand to keep another minute intact. Maria and Tony were there, and Jenna, and the way people moved for each other felt less like choreographed tactics and more like muscle memory. People you trust become weapons of their own benevolence. Vulov pushed through to the kitchen, eyes like coal. He looked for Cassian, like a man smelling blood and math. Cassian met him with something that wasn't the old violence, it was a decision. Words were traded, too sharp to be mundane, and then a shove, and then a fall into brutal practicality. I don't remember all of it as scenes, I remember impressions, a plate breaking like sound, a hand grabbing an apron, Cassian's face being more of a man than it had been before. The moment Vulov died wasn't glorious. It was ugly and precise, and the kind of thing that later writes itself into legalese. He fell in a heap near the doorway, and the men with him faltered. When the leader falls, the pack either disperses or crumbles. The latter happened. Cassian stood with his hands bloody and his chest like a closed door. He turned to me, and the look on his face was beyond words. It was a ledger closing. After the melee, the restaurant smelled of smoke and iron and things we didn't have names for yet. We were all shaking in that stillness that follows a storm. Salvatore arrived in the chaos, older and in control, with sirens in the distance and men moving like professionals. He looked at Cassian, then at me, then at the floor, as if he'd been given a book of our lives and wasn't sure he'd like the ending. After the melee, the restaurant smelled of smoke and iron and things we didn't have names for yet. We were all shaking in that stillness that follows a storm. Salvatore arrived in the chaos, older and in control, with sirens in the distance and men moving like professionals. He looked at Cassian, then at me, then at the floor, as if he'd been given a book of our lives and wasn't sure he'd like the ending. Vulov made his choice, Salvatore said quietly. He chose war. Cassian put his hands in the sink and let them run under cold water as if it could scrub sense back into them. His hands trembled. He had the look of a man who had stayed too long in the dark. It had to end, he said shortly. He wouldn't stop. It ends at a price, Salvatore said to no one and everyone. We pay a price for using the same language. The aftermath was both quieter and louder than I expected. There were injuries, but not gratuitous gore, blood where it mattered, and bandages and tired breaths. There were questions from men who had to manage the story, men with clipboards I hadn't seen before. We cleaned up. Picati looked like something that had survived a storm, which in a way it had. The community that had once been wary came to the doors with casseroles and excuses. They were human like the rest of us, fearful but generous. They wanted to know how to help, and we let them. We let pies and prayers into our kitchen. The weeks that followed were not filmic in any neat way. They were slow and bureaucratic and made of small victories. The commission dealt with fallout. Vulov's death fractured the Bratva's momentum. His men either ran, or they were recruited into other ledgers, or they chose exile. The violence that had been a sharp line softened into a bruise. People mourned and chewed on the moral cost. Cassian grieved in ways that did not come with grand speeches. He held his hand to his face in private and let the grief be a thing without flourish. For me, Picati became a place of rebuilding. We sanded and repainted and reopened with a small sign that read more like a promise than a slogan. I poured myself into the project. I made changes that were honest, a menu that honored simple things, a payroll that didn't hide beneath the table, a kitchen staff that felt like family rather than a ledger entry. We hired a couple of kids from the neighborhood who had talent and bad options. If the family's money came in, it would now go for once towards something that paid people on time.
People came to the reopening, and the room was full of faces that had a history with us. Old regulars, neighbors, men who had nothing to do with any commission, and everything to do with wanting decent food. Salvatore made a toast in private that made me look at him with a different kind of respect. "She did not sign up for any of this," he said quietly. "She saved a life. She stayed." Cassian and I had nights together that were not urgent and not shouted. We gave each other time like a luxury and used it frugally. We learned how to be affectionate without ceremony, like two people who knew their hands had to be practical and gentle at once. He kissed my scars the way people touch the places they've almost lost and are grateful to have back. "Do you ever regret that night?" he asked me once, 2 months after the attack, as we closed up and the last of the chairs were stacked. The restaurant hummed like a place that had been given new oxygen. "Sometimes," I said honestly. "Mostly I think about how small acts have big echoes. I think about how I didn't know my umbrella was cataloged." He laughed then, a real laugh that made the corner of his mouth ease. "It seems a poor trade to have a life be altered by rain." "It wasn't a trade," I said. "It was a choice. You chose to be honest about wanting to change things. I chose to hand you a towel." He reached for my hand and I let him. Hands are small, stubborn things. They say yes and no before our mouths learn to. There were days later, when the sun smelt like coal and baking bread, that I would stand at the service store and watch the neighborhood move. Picati had become a hub, a place where people came for coffee and left with jobs, where Cassian's family paid for apprenticeships, where Salvatore's men sat in the corner and read newspapers instead of contracts. It was not a miracle. It was slow work. It was also significant. We married quietly, the way people who have seen too many grand gestures do, without a spectacle and with a deep sense of what a private promise feels like when it's honest. Salvatore stood with us. Val grinned like a man relieved of a heavy winter. Jenna cried like a sprinkler. And my mother, who had taught me about small mercies, stood at my side with a napkin in her fist. There was music that wasn't much, and there was laughter that had a particular kind of relief. We didn't pretend the world outside would be gentle. We just agreed to be each other's weather. The wedding was in Picati, a place that had once been a refuge for men who needed food and had been converted in some honest way into a home. We danced between tables that had seen arguments and reconciliations. People who had once been customers became witnesses. It felt right. It felt dangerous in the best of ways. I felt like a woman who had started in the rain and had ended in warmth. After the wedding, we reopened the restaurant with a sign that felt less like an advertisement and more like a testimony. Picati's business model was no longer a front. It was a real restaurant that paid taxes and hired people. Cassian worked on legal contracts and partnerships with honest investors who didn't read the kind of ledgers he had once known. Salvatore softened in ways that felt earned. His voice had less of the sharp accounting and more of a steady tone that made people feel accounted for. Val took to teaching in the afternoons, and sometimes I would find him giving a kid from the neighborhood some advice about how to carry yourself like you were already respectable. We didn't rewrite the whole story. There are parts of our ledger that always had ink that won't rub out. Things we did to survive that were ugly and necessary. We didn't pretend otherwise. But we tried to set the pen a little straighter. We asked ourselves what it meant to be culpable and to try to be better nonetheless. That question didn't come with easy answers. It came with choices. Years later, when the rain hit and the city smeared its lights across the pavement, I would stand at the door of Picati with an umbrella in my hand, like a woman who had once been offered shelter and had turned around to offer it back. Cassian would be in the kitchen sometimes, sleeves rolled, laughing with the line cook about some new recipe he tried that was too ambitious. We had children of our own later, 2 small lives who chewed with a seriousness I recognized. And Picati had grown into a place with a steady warmth. When the neighborhood had reasons to celebrate, they came and filled the room. When they had reasons to grieve, they stood shoulder to shoulder with us. The restaurant had become a civic hearth. Sometimes, alone at the end of a long day, I would take out a small thing I kept in the drawer behind the register. A tiny, jagged cylinder that used to live between Cassian's teeth. It was dull and shaped like a secret. Rosa, remember Rosa, the medic, had examined it once in the compound like someone inspecting a curious stone. She had called it a tracker, and we had crushed it like a cigarette and set it aside as proof that sometimes things meant to locate you could be extinguished by the right hands. That little cylinder sits in my palm sometimes like proof that life changes shape. That night, simple and rainy, did not announce itself as a hinge. It was only later, in the ledger of decisions, that I saw myself changing from someone who handed out plates into someone who tended a community. The kindness of offering a lift wasn't a moral theory. It was a practical decision that tipped a scale. It wasn't that I wanted to be a hero. I wanted to be a woman who did what was right when the choice presented itself. That, more than anything, is how the life of a man with dangerous enemies became the life we built together. More messy, more accountable, and a hair more hopeful. We never stopped being honest about the cost.
There were nights when Cassian would wake and his face would fold into memories. And there were times when I would stand at the sink with my hands in hot water and feel the weight of choices we'd made. But the ledger had shifted. We read the lines differently and tried to write better entries. Years after that rainy night, when my son asked me how I met his father, I didn't tell him a sanitized version. I told him about the umbrella and the Mercedes and the way a man walked into a restaurant with blood on his shirt. I told him how I wrapped towels around someone I didn't know because it felt like the right thing to do. He listened like children do, half skeptical and half convinced by the sheer audacity of grown people's stories. "Did he hurt people?" my daughter asked once, blunt as a spoon. "Sometimes," I said, because it's true. But he also tried to make things better. "Did you ever hate being part of it?" she asked. I thought about all the nights I had scrubbed grease off my hands and all the mornings I rose with a stomach full of worry. "No," I said finally. "I hated some of it. I hated the way other people thought violence was an answer. But I loved that for once we tried to be honest. The city keeps raining and then not raining. Sometimes the umbrella is in the hook by the door, and sometimes we forget it. The small acts of kindness that begin a story are often the ones that would fit on a napkin, but they ripple. A ride in a black Mercedes on a wet night became, in time, the axis of a life that turned towards something steadier. I learned that kindness is not always a clean thing. It attracts trouble, it asks for bravery, and sometimes it asks you to pay for what you gave. It also makes life possible. If this story taught me anything, it's that the world is made of small decisions stacked together until they become a life. If a woman can hand a towel to a stranger, and that stranger can decide to turn away from old ways, then there is hope that some calculations can be amended. We didn't erase every wrong. We did, however, try to make amends where it mattered, in a menu that paid its staff, in a contract that didn't hide, in a marriage that didn't disguise debt as affection. That was our redemption. Ugly, expensive, and true. So when the rain returns and the city lights smear like watercolor, I open the door of Picati and let people in. I hand them plates and listen to their stories. I offer umbrellas when needed, and sometimes people hand back the kindness. The world is not rewritten by a single night, but it can be nudged. A woman with an umbrella can be the hinge in more than one life. If you liked this kind of story, hard choices, small mercies, messy redemption, there are more like it waiting. Subscribe for more romantic suspense stories and behind-the-scenes looks at how these scenes were imagined. And if you ever find yourself with an umbrella to spare, remember that sometimes the smallest shelter can change the course of everything.